On a cold night in November of 2013, a woman sat in a hospital waiting room wondering if her new husband would survive until the morning. It was a cruel reversal because just months ago, she had actually told him that she was dying. And in fact, it was her terminal diagnosis that defined their marriage from the start. But now, it looked like she was the one who'd be preparing for a funeral. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button is really struggling to fall asleep because they're scared, offer to tell them a very comforting bedtime story, and then proceed to tell them Bell's Canyon. Around 8 p.m. on November 3rd, 2013, 45-year-old Will Walker taped up a cardboard box in the master bedroom of his home in Cleveland, Ohio. He labeled it with a Sharpie and then stacked it with a bunch of other moving boxes in the corner that he had also made up. Will was in the middle of moving his family out of their current place in the city to a bigger house in the suburbs. And even though it did sort of seem like an upgrade, he had mixed feelings about it, in part because he'd invested a lot in this community in the city. He'd raised kids here with his first wife, and he also worked here as a lieutenant firefighter. But Will knew it was time for a big life change, because his beloved new wife, Yuloma Curry Walker, had recently been diagnosed with cancer. And realistically, she actually didn't have very long left to live, and so Will wanted her to spend the time that she had left in a neighborhood that was more comfortable and more quiet than this one. As Will began to pack one of those moving boxes he had made, he felt his stomach growl. He was hungry. So before getting into really heavy packing, he stopped and he headed down the hallway to the living room, where he found his wife laying on the couch wrapped in a blanket. And she was clearly on the phone with her 17-year-old daughter, Jackie. So Will and Yuloma both had previously been married, and they both had kids from their previous marriages. But most of them were adults, and they had moved out and they were living their own lives. Except for Jackie, the girl that was on the phone with Yuloma right now. She actually still lived with Yuloma and Will. But this evening, she was across town at her boyfriend's place, but for the time being, she was just chatting with her mom on the phone. As Will approached the couch, Yuloma looked up at him and she waved and she smiled. And as she continued chatting with Jackie on the phone, she began coughing, just a small dry cough, but immediately Will was on edge because anytime he heard his wife coughing or just acting like she was sick, he worried that this was the start of the end. Is this her dying? He was just so worried about her. But luckily the coughing passed and she just kept on chatting away with Jackie. And so Will, he walked up to her and he sort of gently interrupted her and just said, "Hey, you want me to run out and grab us both some dinner? I'm pretty hungry." Yuloma, she nodded and she smiled and she covered up the phone and said, "Yeah, I'd love to get some McDonald's." And then she just went back to her call with Jackie. And then Will, he bent down and he kissed her on the top of the head, he grabbed his keys, and he headed out the door. McDonald's sounded great. A half an hour later, at 8:30 p.m., Will pulled back into his driveway and parked in front of the garage. He cut the engine, and then he grabbed the McDonald's bag off the passenger seat. As he stepped out of the car, though, he paused and intentionally looked back out toward the street, just to make sure the coast was clear. So Will had lived on this block for decades, and it had always been sort of a rough neighborhood. But lately, it just seemed to be getting a whole lot worse. Less than a month ago, Will had actually gotten into this really heated argument with a guy right here in his driveway. And it had been so heated that Will had actually brandished a gun to get the guy to leave. Will was still very much on edge about that, sort of worried this man would come back to, exact his revenge or something. And in some ways, this was another reason why he felt like maybe it really was time to move out of here and get to the suburbs. But for now, looking out to the road and the sort of surrounding areas, he didn't see anything or anyone that concerned him. So he closed his car door and with his McDonald's bag in hand, he crossed the driveway towards the back door of the house. However, when he slipped his key into the lock on the door, he heard footsteps coming up behind him. And as Will turned, there was a deafening bang. Inside the house at the same time, Yuloma heard the sound of what sounded like 4 gunshots echoing from outside. Instinctively, she leapt off the couch and ran over to the window, still clutching her blanket tight around her. And when she looked outside, she saw her husband's car in the driveway, but she didn't see her husband, or anyone for that matter. Nobody was outside. Then she heard the sound of someone moaning in pain, and it was like instinctively she immediately knew it had to be Will. And so she ran to the back door. She's frantic. She opens it up, and there he was. 30 minutes later, around 9 p.m., Detective Tom Lynch of the Cleveland Police Department stood outside of Will and Yuloma's back door, staring down at a pool of blood on the ground. Behind him, an officer was cordoning off what was now a crime scene, while detectives and forensic specialists searched the area for evidence. Lynch had reached the scene only about 10 minutes ago, but already he had pieced together some basic facts. Will Walker, the victim, was a 45-year-old lieutenant firefighter, and he had been shot 4 times in his own driveway. His wife, Yuloma, had found him bleeding out by the back door and immediately called 911, and Will had been rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. He was obviously very badly hurt, but apparently he was still alive. Now, Lynch knew that because Will Walker, the victim, was a respected member of the community, he was a, longtime firefighter, that very likely there would be increased pressure on Lynch and his team to figure out who did this. But in a neighborhood as rough as this one, Lynch knew that was not going to be an easy task. Now, as Lynch studied the outside of the crime scene, his gaze traveled from the pool of blood where Will had been found to the bag of fast food lying a few feet away, and then up to the keys that were still dangling from the lock on the door. It looked like Will had been ambushed while walking from his car to the house. It was a very short distance, which meant the shooter would have only had maybe a few seconds to make their move. Lynch heard someone call his name from behind him, and he turned around to see another detective just a few feet away, pointing to something in the grass. And so Lynch walked over and then crouched down and saw that what they were pointing to was a 9mm shell casing. Then the detective pointed out another shell casing, and then another, and another. And they all led in a straight line toward the back corner of the garage. Not inside the garage, but like the back exterior of the garage. And so Lynch, he followed the line of shell casings towards that corner, and he found there was this small gap between the back of the garage and the back fence. In this area, there were no lights. It was very well shielded from the street. Like if you were back here, nobody could see you, really. And so this was like a perfect hiding spot for the shooter. As Lynch took in all this new information, he tried to visualize what might have happened here. He pictured the shooter waiting right here behind the garage, not coming from the street, but over here waiting. And then Will comes into the driveway, he gets out of his car, he makes his way towards the door, at which point the shooter comes out and starts shooting. It was an ambush, which suggested that, especially based on the location of these shell casings, like this was truly somebody waiting for Will. This was not like a botched robbery. This was not random. This was someone who likely knew Will was going to be back soon, and they waited for him, and then they shot him. And so at this point, Lynch felt pretty confident that this was a premeditated murder, or at least attempted murder, because at that point, it was believed that Will was still alive at the hospital. And if he was still alive, Lynch hoped he'd be able to identify the shooter. 2 hours later, around 11:30 p.m., Lynch followed a nurse down a hospital corridor. Will Walker was still in surgery, so in the meantime, Lynch was going to speak with Will's wife, Yuloma. The nurse led Lynch into a private waiting room for family members, and right away, Lynch saw Yuloma sitting alone in one of the chairs. She was wearing a big coat and a scarf, but she kept rubbing her hands together and shivering like she was cold. Lynch nodded to the nurse to let her know that he could take it from here, and so she left to give them some privacy. Then Lynch went over to introduce himself to Yuloma. He sat down and he took out his notepad, and then he gently explained that he was leading the investigation into Will's shooting, and he needed to know everything she could remember about that night. Yuloma, who was still clearly very cold and shivering, she nodded, and in a weak voice, she explained that just before the gunshots, she'd been home alone. Will had been out getting them dinner, and her daughter Jackie was over at her boyfriend's place. Then at 8:30 p.m., she said she heard those 4 loud bangs. She'd run outside and found her husband bleeding out in the driveway, and so she called 911. Lynch nodded as he jotted down everything she was saying. But nothing she was saying was particularly revelatory. I mean, her story matched up with what he had seen at the crime scene and what first responders had told him about what they saw. So now Lynch flipped his notepad over, and he asked the question that in some ways mattered the most in terms of what Yuloma could offer him. Did her husband have any enemies? However, before Yuloma could answer, there was a knock at the door, and a second later, a pair of doctors came inside. And from their expressions, Lynch knew it was not good news. Instinctively, Lynch stood up and stepped out of the way as one of these doctors came over to Yoloma and they took her hand and told her that her husband, Will Walker, was dead. Around 9 a.m. the next morning, November 4th, Detective Tom Lynch stood in the rec room of a Cleveland fire station speaking to 3 firefighters who were co-workers of Will Walker, who had been shot to death the night before. Lynch's conversation with Will's wife, Yoloma, the night before in the hospital had understandably been cut short when she received the news of her husband's death. So now Lynch was trying to get information from anyone else who was close to Will before he ultimately went back and asked Yoloma that question about, did her husband have any enemies? And so for now, he was here at the fire station to find out if maybe any of Will's coworkers knew about any conflicts Will had with anybody. But so far, from speaking with the guys who worked with Will, it sounded like he was the most popular guy at the station. Everybody liked him. These firefighters kept telling Lynch what a hero Will was, and how Lynch needed to solve this case quickly because Will and his family, they deserve justice. The community deserved justice. So Lynch was naturally feeling a lot of pressure to deliver here. But he was actually kind of optimistic for 2 reasons. First, because DNA had been recovered from the shell casing from Will's driveway. Now, the DNA didn't match anyone in law enforcement databases, but this was still a really strong development because Lynch knew he'd be able to test any suspects against that DNA from the shells. And the second reason he was optimistic is because once he was finished here at the fire station, Lynch actually was heading to an interview with Yoloma. She'd had a little time to process the news, and now, apparently, she was ready to speak to him again. A half hour later, Lynch was sitting across from Yoloma inside of an interview room at the Cleveland police station. She looked absolutely exhausted, and by now, Lynch knew that it was not just from having been up all night, very likely, dealing with the grief of losing her husband, but also because, according to Will's coworkers, Yoloma had cancer. And in fact, it was her terminal cancer diagnosis that had ultimately pushed Will to marry her after 8 years together. Prior to the diagnosis, Will and Yoloma had sort of taken their time in terms of how they would define their relationship, because they'd both been married before, and they didn't want to rush into anything, because obviously their previous marriages didn't go well. But when Yoloma got really sick, and it was clear she didn't have much time left, they decided, enough waiting, let's just get married. And so now, Lynch picked up with Yoloma where they had left off the night before. He asked her again, did Will have any enemies? And after spending the entire morning listening to Will's coworkers talk about what a good man Will was, Lynch expected Yoloma to say no. But instead, Yoloma nodded and said yes, he did. But she also quickly said that it was definitely true that the vast majority of people loved Will, her included. He was a great guy. He was very popular at work, and he was beloved in the neighborhood. And he was very close with his kids and stepkids, and he was even on good terms with his ex-wife Rita. But Yoloma said she could think of at least 2 men Will definitely had not gotten along with. Yoloma explained that the first man she suspected was actually her own ex-husband, Macklin Hines. Yoloma described Macklin as an ex-convict with an explosive temper. She said Macklin had always been very possessive towards her, even after they had gotten a divorce. And that possessiveness had only intensified after she had recently married Will just 4 months ago. Yoloma said she didn't know if Macklin was jealous enough to have committed murder here, but she knew he was definitely capable of violence. And she said that she had not heard from Macklin in several days. The second person that Yoloma said Will had issues with was actually a man from the neighborhood named Eugene Cray. According to Yoloma, Eugene was friends with their next-door neighbor, and whenever Eugene came by to pick up his friend, the neighbor, he would sit out in his car smoking weed, blasting music, and blocking Yoloma and Will's driveway. And Yoloma said this had really bothered Will. And a few weeks before the murder, he'd finally lost his patience. One afternoon, when Eugene had shown up again with his car, blocking the driveway, blasting his music, smoking his weed, Will had pulled out his handgun and stormed out of the house to confront him. Now, Yoloma said she hadn't seen what happened next, but she heard shouting and then the sound of Eugene speeding away, and when Will came back inside, clearly amped up from this confrontation, he just told Yoloma that he had handled it and Eugene would not be back. And so at this point, Lynch stopped for a second and just thought about what he had been told. In terms of this Eugene story, it sounded like Will had really lost his temper. And if he had maybe embarrassed or threatened Eugene, that was the kind of thing that could turn into a grudge that could lead to murder. And so at this point, to Lynch, Eugene was sounding like a really, really good suspect, especially since his recent argument with Will had actually taken place in the same area where Will was ultimately killed. 3 days later, on November 7th, around 6 p.m., Detective Lynch walked through a big candlelight vigil on Yoloma and Will Street. A massive crowd, hundreds of neighbors, firefighters, and police officers had come out to honor Will. Lynch scanned the crowd, and he eventually found Will's family, and they were clearly speaking with reporters. Will's 2 adult children were standing there beside this woman who Lynch guessed was Will's ex-wife, Rita Walker, and then a few feet away from them was Yoloma, looking very frail as she leaned on her teenage daughter, Jackie. And for Lynch, seeing this vigil and seeing, Will's bereaved family just standing there in the middle of all this just sadness, it was heart-wrenching. And in part because he knew that despite his early optimism, the investigation into Will's killer was really not going particularly well, at least not so far. For the past couple of days, Lynch and his team have been trying to contact Eugene by phone and at his home, but he seemed to have just vanished. And to make matters worse, Lynch's other main suspect, Yoloma's ex-husband, Macklin Hines, hadn't panned out. It turned out there was actually an extremely good reason why nobody had heard from him for days around the time of the shooting. It was because Hines had actually been in jail on the night of Will's murder. Like, he literally couldn't have done this. Now, of course, it was still possible that he could have hired someone to do it, but as for now, it seemed like Macklin was not as good of a suspect as they once thought. And now, as Lynch stood there at this vigil amongst so many mourners, he knew that if his investigation didn't start delivering answers soon, a lot of people were going to be very disappointed. And to get those answers, Lynch knew they needed to find Eugene Cray. More than a month later, Detective Lynch was back inside of the police station's interview room, sitting across from a skinny, scowling man. This was Eugene Cray, and he'd walked into the station earlier that morning, demanding to know why the police were leaving flyers with this photo all over his block. And Lynch had actually been kind of amused that Eugene was acting so indignant, because for more than a month, police had been doing everything they possibly could just to contact this guy. They'd knocked on Eugene's door, they left messages, asked Eugene's neighbors for help, but there had not been one single peep out of Eugene that entire time, almost like he didn't want to be found. But the flyers seemed to have flushed Eugene out, and now Lynch sat across from him, waiting for him to explain why he'd apparently been in hiding since the night of Will's death. But Eugene just folded his arms and said he didn't have anything to do with the shooting. He said he'd been at home in bed that night listening to music with his headphones on. So he said he hadn't even heard the gunshots, and he lived in the same rough area, so he would have, but he didn't, because he was in bed with headphones on. Now, Lynch thought this was a very poor alibi because, Eugene didn't have anybody who could confirm that he had been at home, in bed, headphones on at the time of the murder. It was just his word against everybody else's. And so instead of trying to, dig into the alibi, Lynch just asked Eugene about that confrontation he had had with Will a few weeks before the shooting. And Eugene told him pretty much the same story that Yoloma had. That he had been outside, he'd been sitting in his car, according to him, he was minding his own business, when Will suddenly appeared, storming out of his house, waving a gun in the air, yelling for Eugene to turn down his music. And Eugene said, just from the look on Will's face, he seemed mad enough that he might actually use the gun. So Eugene said he just sped off as fast as he could. Lynch studied Eugene as he was saying this, and there was just something about this guy's demeanor that it seemed unlikely that Eugene would have let their conflict end right there. That, Will came out, he yelled at Eugene, and Eugene drove off, and that was it. Like, the idea that Eugene was just gonna go on with life and not be upset with Will, it just seemed sort of far-fetched. And so he really wanted Eugene's DNA. That way he could just test it against the showcasing DNA and find out the truth. But Lynch knew that Eugene had a history of prior arrests and seemed to know his way around a police interview, so Lynch guessed that if he pressed for a DNA swab right now, Eugene would refuse and very likely lawyer up. But Lynch at the same time felt like he really did need this swab, like he had to ask. So, doing his best to not seem too eager, Lynch leaned back in his chair and, as casually as possible, asked if Eugene would submit a DNA sample, just so they could rule him out as a suspect. And to Lynch's surprise, Eugene just shrugged and said, okay. About 3 months after the murder, in February of 2014, Detective Lynch sat at his desk reading through a thick stack of financial documents. Now, by this point, the Will Walker murder investigation had pretty much stalled out, because Eugene Cray's DNA did not match the DNA on the shell casings found at the scene. Still, Lynch had pressed on and questioned everyone he could think of: Will's neighbors, his coworkers, his kids, his stepkids, and even their romantic partners. Lynch's team had also poured through hours upon hours of security camera footage collected from the homes and businesses that were near Will's house. But even after all that effort, Lynch was nowhere closer to solving this case. So now, with really no other ideas, Lynch was just going through all of Will's financial records that he could get his hands on: bank statements, loan documents, mortgages. And Lynch's eyes were starting to glaze over when a stray form suddenly caught his eye. It was an addendum to a $100,000 life insurance policy for Will. According to this form, to this addendum, in the event that Will died, that money would not go to Yoloma or his kids or his immediate family. It would go to his ex-wife, Rita Walker, who he hadn't been married to for 9 years. The following afternoon, in February of 2014, Detective Tom Lynch led Rita Walker into an interview room at the Cleveland police station. And Rita seemed very confused about why she was being questioned again, 3 months after her ex-husband, Fire Lieutenant Will Walker, had been murdered. So immediately after the killing, Rita, along with Yoloma and all the kids and stepkids, they had all been interviewed pretty much right away. And at the time, Lynch hadn't even considered Rita a suspect. So this time, when Lynch sat down with her, the questions were different, because now there appeared to be a clear motive for Rita to want to harm Will. So he began by asking Rita where she was on the night of the murder. And right away, Rita's expression sort of tightened. She paused and then said that she couldn't really remember all the details, but she said that she had stopped by Will and Yoloma's house around 1 p.m. to pick up her son, who had spent that morning helping Will and Yoloma pack. And this information sort of caught Lynch off guard. I mean, he knew that, Will was shot at night, and Rita is describing being at Will's house in the afternoon, so hours before the shooting. But here she was, admitting that she was there on the day of the murder. She was at the scene of the crime. So Detective Lynch moved on to the real reason he had asked her to come down. And he asked about that life insurance policy that listed her, rather than Yoloma or anybody else in the family, as the beneficiary. And Rita, she sat back for a second and just stared at Lynch. And then she nodded and said, of course she knew about that, because that was how it was meant to be. She explained to Lynch that Will had taken out that policy as a safety net for his kids, and he had named Rita as the beneficiary because he trusted her to divide the money between their kids. And to Lynch, he had to admit this did sort of make sense, but he also had a different theory. He suspected that Will had just never gotten around to updating the form, but with his recent marriage to Yoloma, it was probably on his to-do list. And if Rita had figured that out, it might have pushed her to have Will killed before he could remove her from his own policy. But that was really just a hunch that he kept to himself. And Lynch also knew he really didn't have the evidence to charge Rita with anything here. And after almost half an hour of questioning, Rita was still very confidently sticking to her story. So eventually Lynch told her that she was free to go. Then Lynch, he got up and he walked Rita out to the front of the building. But as he watched Rita get into her car and pull out of the parking lot, his eyes narrowed because he suddenly realized he recognized Rita's car from somewhere. Lynch's mind immediately began to race as he ran back to his office and turned on his computer. And once the computer was on, he pulled up the security footage from Will's neighborhood. And after scrubbing through a dozen files, he found what he was looking for. A security camera had captured footage of Rita's car just a few blocks away from Will's house right before he was killed. This was clearly not that afternoon visit that Rita had already told Lynch about. This was a second visit to Will's neighborhood that she had not mentioned at all. Less than half an hour later, Rita was back inside the interview room, and Lynch was staring her down as she frantically tried to explain herself. Now that Lynch had confronted her with this footage, Rita had totally changed her story, admitting that she had actually gone back to Will's house that night. But she said it was just to pick up some shoes her son had left there and that she'd left long before Will's murder. But what Rita really couldn't explain was, if this was so innocent, why hadn't she mentioned it before? And so now, Lynch just stared at her, letting his silence pressure her to keep on talking. He was hoping Rita would slip up or crack or confess, but as the interview went on, Rita just kept insisting again and again that this was an honest mistake, that second visit meant nothing, she was just getting shoes, and she didn't know why she didn't bring it up. And this was a problem for Lynch and the whole investigation, because even though the facts did look quite bad for Rita, she had a motive, she had been at the crime scene close to the time of the murder, and she'd failed to tell the police about being at the crime scene. But Lynch knew that he still didn't have enough to charge her with anything. And so Lynch sat there hoping that Rita would, offer up something that would allow him to charge her, like a confession or just anything. But she stuck to her story again and again. And eventually, once more, he had to let her walk out. 9 months later, in December of 2014, Detective Lynch was in his office when his phone rang. He answered, and the station receptionist said a man from Will Walker's neighborhood had just come into the precinct, claiming he had vital information about the murder. Apparently, this man was being escorted to an interview room, and Lynch could go question him when he was ready. Lynch said thank you and hung up the phone, but then he just sort of sighed and sat back and rubbed his forehead because he was not optimistic about this new lead. Because 1 month ago, the Cleveland Firefighters Union had announced a $24,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of Will's killer. And ever since then, the station had been flooded with false tips. And so Lynch and his team, they'd spent weeks chasing down basically rumors that went nowhere, and it was really frustrating. So even though he figured that, whoever this guy was waiting for him in the interview room was very likely gonna go nowhere, it was gonna be another dead end, he still felt like, I got nothing else to do. I'll go see, what he knows. So he stood up, he left his office, he made his way down the hall, he walked into the interview room, and sure enough, there's this guy he didn't know who's sitting behind the table. And so Lynch, he sat down as well, and he just said, okay, what do you know about what happened to Will Walker? And this man, instead of saying anything in response to that question, just pulled out his phone, put it on the table, and hit play. And when Lynch realized what he was listening to, his eyes went wide, because the audio on this man's phone had just cracked the case wide open. Based on the evidence that was collected at the crime scene and on witness testimony, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Will Walker on the night of November 3rd, 2013. At around 8:30 p.m., the killer, who was very nervous, was hiding in the shadows behind Will Walker's garage. They were doing their best to try to calm themselves down, to be ready for what they were about to do, but they knew it was going to be very risky for them. Just then, the killer heard a car pulling into the driveway. And as the engine cut off, the killer leaned out of their hiding spot and saw Will Walker step out of his car with a fast food bag in one hand and his keys in the other. The killer took a deep breath at this point because they knew this was it. And as Will began walking across the driveway toward the back door, the killer drew their gun, rushed out of their hiding spot, and began shooting. And they ran as they shot. And as Will fell to the ground, a flash of red in the air told the killer that they had hit him. So without stopping to check for a pulse, to make sure Will was actually dead, the killer turned and ran to the fence, climbed over it, and jumped down into the alley behind the house where the getaway car was waiting. The killer leapt into the back seat right as the driver began peeling out of the alleyway, and as they're speeding along, the person sitting in the front passenger seat turned around and asked the killer, "Is Will dead?" And when the killer, who was still laying in the back seat composing themselves, they nodded and said yes, he was, the person in the passenger seat just turned back around, pulled out their phone, typed a text, and then hit send. That text message confirming the shooting went straight to the person who had actually orchestrated this hit on Will Walker. And when the text came through to the architect's phone, that person was actually standing over Will as he bled out. The architect was also the same person who called 911 and who would cradle Will as he lay there dying, because the mastermind of this murder was Will Walker's beloved, cancer-stricken wife, Yaloma Curry Walker. Except Yaloma was not at all what she seemed, starting with the fact that she didn't actually have cancer. From the very beginning, Yaloma's cancer diagnosis had been a big, elaborate lie. Police believe she fabricated the illness just to convince Will to finally marry her, because that way she could, 1, be put on his health insurance policy, and 2, if he were to die, she could collect on his life insurance policy. But Yaloma didn't realize that Will's life insurance policy was still in Rita's name. But despite that oversight, it did not stop Yaloma from putting a tremendous amount of planning into the plot to murder Will. In fact, if you remember that phone call that Yaloma was having with her daughter Jackie, that when Will walked in the living room, there was Yaloma, she's on the phone, and he asked her if she wanted dinner, and she's like, yeah, go to McDonald's. Well, that phone call with Jackie is the one that actually sealed his fate. Because the instant Will left the house to go get their dinner, Yaloma, who's still on the phone with Jackie, told her daughter that, hey, he just left. And Jackie, who knew the plan, she passed that message along to her boyfriend, Chad Padgett, who was sitting in a car right down the street from Will's house, waiting for this message. And he was there along with this getaway car driver and the man he had hired to actually carry out the shooting. The shooter was Ryan Doherty, a young man from the neighborhood who had agreed to kill Will for $800 and some marijuana. And the getaway car driver was actually just a friend of Chad's who thought they were there to buy drugs. Yaloma had promised to pay Jackie and Chad for finding people to kill her husband for her, but Chad was very sloppy, and one of the people he offered the job to was later caught on tape talking about it. And that recording is how the investigators came to learn that Chad, Jackie, and Yaloma were all involved. And at first, they really couldn't believe it, because Yaloma's performance as a cancer-stricken, dying widow had been so masterful, no one had looked close enough to see who she really was. Yaloma Curry Walker was arrested on September 8, 2015, and she was ultimately sentenced to life in prison for her role in the murder plot. As for the people she convinced to participate in this plot, they were convicted on a range of charges and spent between 2 years and life in prison. And then as for Rita Walker, Will's ex-wife, she was not involved in the murder in any way, so her story was absolutely true, and she would eventually receive that life insurance payout, just as Will had planned. On November 16, 2009, Kay Mortensen walked in the front door of his second home in Payson, Utah, a small city south of Salt Lake City. Most of the time, he and his wife Darla lived about 250 miles away, but Kay had a lot of valuable stuff in the Payson house, including at least 100 guns and rifles, and so he liked to check in on the property at least once a month. Kay was riding high these days. At 70 years old, he liked to say that he had finally found the love of his life in Darla. They had each raised separate families before finding each other 3 years earlier through the Mormon church, and now they worked together as volunteer tour guides at a Mormon historic site, which was perfect for Kay, who was a retired Brigham Young University professor. This job allowed him to indulge his love for teaching and his love for Darla all at the same time. That day, Darla was heading out to babysit her granddaughters in Salt Lake City, so she'd be gone for hours, leaving Kay to do chores around the property all by himself. Now, the house was out in the country, kind of isolated and surrounded by woods, but Darla never worried about her husband when he was left alone at the house, because her husband, Kay, was not your typical retired professor. The man was a black belt in karate who always carried a gun and kept weapons in virtually every room of the house. Darla almost felt sorry for anyone who tried to tangle with Kay. Once, Kay shot a neighbor's Great Dane dog that he just said was threatening him, so he was obviously ready to pull the trigger. Darla kissed Kay goodbye, walked outside to her car, and then drove off to spend time with her grandkids. And once Darla was gone, Kay immediately stepped outside to inspect his pride and joy. Not many people knew about his pride and joy, but he had built an underground bomb shelter near the house where his family could take refuge when the inevitable nuclear war that he was so scared of finally began. Kay had constructed the shelter to very high professional standards, including an air filtration system and enough concrete to withstand a missile blast. There was even a bathroom and a composting toilet. Kay bent down and grabbed the handle of a heavy metal door that was sitting in the ground, and he opened it up, revealing a staircase. And then he went down those stairs and through another door, where he entered into the pitch-black shelter. Kay flipped on the lights and looked with satisfaction at the contents of his hideaway. There were canned foods and bottled water stacked to the ceiling. There was a small library of classic books and magazines, and there were 20 guns with ample ammunition. When Kay flipped another switch, he heard the electric hum of the air system kicking in. Everything was the way it should be. Kay knew that some people thought he was totally a crazy extremist whenever he talked about his belief that the United States was destined to be destroyed by nuclear war with the Russians or civil war right at home. But he was in good company in Utah. When he had taken a course in disaster preparedness a few years earlier, he was surrounded by familiar faces from the area, including Martin Bond, the son of one of Kay's closest friends. They had joked that Utah might be more ready for nuclear catastrophe than anywhere else in the world. And Kay had already made a fortune by predicting America's doom. He was so sure that the US dollar would soon become worthless that he had begun investing in gold as a young man. And sure enough, the price of gold had skyrocketed over the decades, and so now Kay was a multimillionaire. It was a good thing he'd made all that money, Kay thought as he walked back to the house from his bomb shelter. His oldest child, Roger, who lived just down the road in Payson, was constantly in need of money for one thing or another. Kay loved Roger, but his son, despite being 48 years old, really couldn't take care of himself, not since he suffered a severe head injury from driving his ATV off a cliff in 1994. Ever since then, Roger had not been able to hold a steady job for very long. Kay had already put his wealth into a trust that would be divided among his 3 kids, but he knew that Roger would continue to cost him money for the rest of his days. Despite Kay's misgivings about his son, he was looking forward to seeing Roger and his wife Pam that evening. Pam had called the night before to suggest they drop by to play board games before Kay and Darla went back to their primary home 250 miles away. The couple might be needy, Kay thought, but they were loyal. They never missed a chance to see him while he was in town. But first, Kay had chores to do that would take most of the day, including getting the house ready for another snowy Utah winter. Also, the internet service was acting kind of shaky, and so he had called a tech to come take a look. So when he heard a car pulling up the driveway around 4, he thought it might be the tech guy. And when the doorbell rang, Kay opened the door without giving it a second thought. Around 5:30 p.m., so less than an hour later, Kay's son, Roger, and daughter-in-law, Pam, pulled into Kay's driveway, and they could see that Kay had company. A blue hatchback car that they didn't recognize was sitting in front of the house. Pam figured it was a handyman helping Kay with his internet problems, or maybe replacing a worn-out carpet that Darla hated. Pam rang the doorbell with a smile on her face and a pecan pie in her hand, Kay's favorite. A friend at work had given Pam the pie as a gift that morning, and all day she couldn't wait to give it to Kay. But when the door opened, it was not Kay. Instead, a man in his 20s with a blank look on his face greeted them and let them inside, saying, "Don't worry, Kay was right upstairs." Two hours later, at about 7:45 p.m., a very strange 911 call came into the county sheriff's office that patrolled Payson. When the dispatcher answered, a woman with a calm voice told her that she and her husband had just been held hostage for the last 2 hours by gunmen inside of her father-in-law's house, and now the gunmen were gone, and so they were calling the police. The caller was, of course, Pam Mortensen. But when the dispatcher asked Pam for more details, Pam couldn't seem to remember a thing. She said there could have been maybe 3 gunmen, but she wasn't sure. And then when asked what any of them looked like, she said she didn't really get a good look, but they could have been African American. Meanwhile, in the background of this call from Pam, her husband, Roger, so Kay's son, yelled out a different account. He said there were 2 invaders, and they both were white. While Pam continued talking to the dispatcher, Roger yelled out that he was going to go check on his father, who was upstairs. And so Roger ran upstairs, and then moments later, Roger came back downstairs, and while Pam was still on the 911 call, Roger would say out loud that his father was dead. The dispatcher, who heard this, said that sheriff's deputies were on their way. A few minutes later, around 8 p.m., Kay's wife, Darla, who was driving home from her day with her grandchildren, got a call from her neighbor. Her neighbor was usually a laid-back person, but now he sounded totally anxious. He told Darla that there were all kinds of sheriff's deputies at her house in Payson. The friend had no idea what it was about, but he urged Darla to be careful when she went home. Darla hung up and had a horrible thought. What if Kay shot someone? He'd always said he'd kill anyone who tried to break into their house. Maybe it actually happened. Darla then repeatedly began calling Kay's cell phone, but he didn't pick up. And so in a panic, she called a friend and explained what was going on, and the 2 women agreed to meet near Darla's home in Payson at 8:30, and they would find out what was going on together. By 8:30 p.m. that night, yellow police tape blocked access to the driveway at Kay and Darla's house, and police cruisers lined the rural road leading up to it. Even the leader of the investigation, Sergeant Eric Knutson of the Utah County Sheriff's Office, had to park a 10 minutes walk away from the crime scene. But as soon as Knutson arrived at the house, a sheriff's deputy led him through the growing scrum of investigators into the house to the upstairs bathroom. And there, in the bathroom, was the body of Kay Mortensen. He was kneeling on the tile, bent half over his bathtub. His hands and feet were zip-tied together. As Knutson got closer, he could see that Kay's throat had been repeatedly slashed from ear to ear, and he had a deep stab wound in the back of his neck. Whoever had done this had first arranged Kay over the bathtub so that his blood didn't get all over the floor. It was almost like an execution. Knutson was a veteran detective who had seen lots of grisly crime scenes before, but the cruelty of what he was seeing in front of him made him a little bit nauseous. It also puzzled him. Kay was well known for his self-defense skills and his vow to defend his home with deadly force if necessary. How could this have happened? Downstairs in the living room, sheriff's deputies were trying to get more details from Kay's son, Roger, and his wife, Pam, the 2 who had called 911, but it was frustrating work. The couple repeatedly contradicted each other as they tried to describe what happened, or they would just shrug nonchalantly and say they didn't know the answer. Sergeant Knutson saw the looks of mounting annoyance on his deputies' faces as he came down the stairs and gestured for them to stop asking the couple questions. Knutson then led Roger and Pam into the kitchen, where it was a little quieter, and he asked them to have a seat at the table. Knutson then asked one of the deputies to videotape the conversation he was about to have, and then he told Roger and Pam to walk him through what had happened from the top. Knutson's first impression of the couple was that they did not seem traumatized from their ordeal or even particularly sad that Roger's father had clearly just been murdered. Instead, they just kept glancing at each other and smirking like this was some sort of game. Pam explained that they were planning to spend the evening with Kay and Darla, but when they arrived at their house, they were greeted not by Kay and Darla, but by strangers with guns. Pam said that her husband, Roger, sensed trouble immediately and asked the gunmen if they could just take their pecan pie and leave. But the gunmen said no. And then another gunman said very simply, "You've seen our faces, and so now we have to kill you." Knutson listened silently to Pam and Roger's story, but inside, he was thinking that it was totally ridiculous. So they were confronted by 2 men with guns, and their first thought was to try to get their pecan pie back? Shouldn't they have been more worried about Kay's safety or their own? Who would ever think first about saving a pie? But Knutson let Pam continue. Pam said the gunman made them kneel in the living room, and then one of the men zip-tied their hands in front of them while the other zip-tied their ankles. Then the two men just left Pam and Roger kneeling on the ground for a really long time, totally by themselves. Pam said while they were kneeling there, she just prayed to a picture of Jesus that Kay had hung in the living room, as much to calm herself as it was to calm her husband. Roger as well had begun praying loudly while they were kneeling there, and he was right in the middle of a sentence about the Lord being his shepherd when Pam started shushing Roger because she heard the gunman coming back. But to Pam's surprise, one of the gunmen told Roger to keep praying. Then both gunmen bowed their heads and silently listened as Roger asked God to spare his wife and him from harm. After Roger said amen, the gunmen said they had decided not to kill Pam and Roger after all. At this point, Knutson just completely did not believe the couple. Pam and Roger were claiming that the same men who had just slaughtered Kay Mortensen like a hog decided not to kill the only witnesses because they were so moved by Roger's prayer? Are you kidding? But Knutson didn't realize the story was actually about to get even more ridiculous. Pam and Roger continued and said that the gunman had told them they would let the couple live on one condition. Pam and Roger should tell police that they were held hostage by 3 African-American men. That way, investigators would not go looking for the 2 young white men who actually committed the crime. One of the gunmen then took Roger's license from his wallet. If the couple told investigators what really happened, he said, they would come to their house and kill them. The couple then said they escaped from their zip ties as soon as they realized the gunmen were really gone, and then Pam immediately dialed 911. She told Knutson she had to be vague with the 911 operator about the number and race of her attackers because she was trying to tell the lie that they had demanded. But she said Roger, who was kind of yelling in the background during this call, was telling the truth. It really was 2 white men in their early 20s with black hair and maybe a mustache or a goatee. And then Pam told Knutson that Roger had run upstairs to find his father, bound hand and foot and slumped over the bathtub. Kay had bled profusely from deep wounds in his neck, and his body was cold to the touch. Roger knew immediately that his father had been murdered, and so he went downstairs and told Pam. To Knutson, Roger just didn't seem that shaken up about his father's death. In fact, Roger seemed a little gleeful. As the video camera rolled, Roger told Knutson that his father was a, quote, cantankerous old fart, end quote, who never stopped sharing his opinions. He also volunteered that, now that Kay was dead, he was likely to inherit millions of dollars from his father's estate. Sergeant Knutson thought the whole story was absolute nonsense, except for the part about Roger inheriting millions now that his dad was dead. Knutson was mildly offended that Pam and Roger would expect him to believe their cover story. This was not his first day on the job, and these two seemed totally guilty. Kay's wife Darla finally reached the police tape across the driveway to her house a little after 9 p.m., feeling totally exhausted from worrying over the past hour. At this point, she was still expecting to hear about something Kay had done to another person, like shoot them or something. But when Darla identified herself to the sheriff's deputy guarding the driveway, he immediately led her and her friend inside to Sergeant Knutson, who had a grim look on his face. He said he was so sorry, but he had very bad news. Darla's husband was dead. Darla immediately fell against her friend as the world that she and Kay had built dissolved in an instant. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of her stepson Roger just standing in the corner looking beleaguered. Darla ran to him and hugged him tight as she started to weep. The two just stood there in a silent embrace for a long time. Sergeant Knutson watched Darla as she leaned on Roger weeping, and he felt a pang of sorrow for her. But he also knew he was leading a murder investigation that just couldn't wait. If Pam and Roger were actually telling the truth, then that meant the gunmen were still at large, posing a huge threat to other people. Knutson at this point basically did not believe Pam and Roger's story, but he still wanted to give them a chance to fully explain themselves. The stakes were simply too high to do anything else. So, late on the night of the murder, he asked Roger and Pam to come back to the sheriff's office so they could go over everything that happened again, but in a quieter, more peaceful setting. By this point, investigators had done a first sweep of Kay and Darla's home, and they had discovered that about 20 guns in Kay's bomb shelter were now missing. But if the killers were there to rob Kay, why had they only taken 20 guns? Kay had way more guns in the house, some of which were so valuable that Kay kept them in a safe. It made Knutson wonder if the theft of a small portion of the guns was just a part of Pam and Roger's cover story to try to draw suspicion away from themselves. So Sergeant Knutson sent Pam and Roger to separate interview rooms so the investigators could compare Pam's answers to Roger's to see if there were any differences. And almost immediately, Pam and Roger's stories began to go in different directions. Roger said the gunmen were wearing, quote, blue fuzzy gloves, end quote. Pam said they were wearing purple surgical gloves. Roger said he freed them both from the zip ties with the knife he was carrying. Pam said she freed herself. Knutson, sitting across the empty interview table from Pam, finally just stopped asking questions and just stared at her with a mixture of incredulity and irritation. Then Sergeant Knutson took a deep breath and told Pam point blank, "I think your story is a bunch of crap." And then he asked her flat out if her husband was capable of murder. Specifically, could Roger have killed Kay just to get his inheritance early? Pam replied that she didn't think so, and then quickly added, quote, "I personally would not have had my father-in-law killed for money," end quote. But that's exactly what Knutson thought was really going on, that they had killed him for money. And later that night, when Sergeant Knutson showed the videotape of the interviews with Roger and Pam to Kay's wife, Darla, Darla began thinking the same thing. Roger and Pam were clearly acting very suspicious. By the next morning, Knutson and his team had figured out a few things about the death of Kay Mortensen. The crime scene itself was very neat, with no fingerprints, blood spatters, or signs of a struggle for investigators to analyze. That suggested that the crime was totally planned out ahead of time, but it also suggested something more. Kay may have knew his killers. Here was a man who carried a gun at all times because he was so worried about his personal safety, and he was a black belt in karate, but he apparently let the murderers right into the house without any problem. The investigators also realized that their victim was the kind of person who had rubbed a lot of people the wrong way over the years. Stubborn and quick-tempered, Kay had been through 2 divorces before he met Darla, and he was estranged from one of his sons over a fight about money. Over the years, he had fought with Brigham Young colleagues, a business partner, and of course, the woman who owned the Great Dane that he had shot. At the same time, Kay had close friends going back decades, people like Martin Bond, the other guy who was very into doomsday prepping, as well as Martin's father, Mike, and they both lived nearby in Payson. Kay had helped them both cope with the death of Martin's older brother in 1997. Also, Kay could be very generous, loaning money to friends and family in need without really ever pressing for repayment. And so as a result, Kay had died with lots of people who owed him money. And so investigators came up with this long list of people who had something to gain from Kay's death, from revenge to debt forgiveness. But they struggled to identify anyone who would have been motivated to actually kill him. Roger and Pam suggested a guy named Mike Kipp, who apparently was so broke he had recently sold some of his guns to Kay to raise some money. And it just so happened that those were the very same guns that the gunman took from the bomb shelter. And so maybe, they suggested, Kipp just wanted his guns back. But Roger's own relatives increasingly suspected that Roger may have been involved in his father's death, and they let Knutson's team know that Roger had a history of violence. He had once aimed a gun at a vehicle full of Boy Scouts when he was riding on his ATV, and his third ex-wife had accused him of throwing her against the wall and slapping her. He had also battled a drug addiction in the years after his head injury. Roger admitted to having a troubled past, but he insisted that that was the past before he met Pam and settled down. And he loved his father. They had bonded over their love of guns and often traded weapons. He considered his dad to be his best friend and said that he gave him money anytime he asked for it, and he also helped him break his addiction to drugs, and so why would he want to kill his dad?
But when Roger agreed to take a lie detector test, he failed it. The analyst concluded that Roger was trying to be deceptive. Investigators tracked down the suspect that Pam and Roger had suggested, Mike Kipp, to see if he could have conceivably killed Kay to get his guns back. But Kipp told the sheriff's deputies who came to his house that he was not at all angry at Kay. He was grateful that Kay was willing to pay him $25,000 for some 30 weapons, money that he desperately needed. He was distraught over Kay's murder, and he had witnesses who knew Kipp was nowhere near Kay's house on the day Kay was killed. Sergeant Knutson quickly decided that Mike Kipp did not kill Kay Mortensen. Meanwhile, Knutson's deputies were having a hard time confirming key parts of Pam and Roger's story about the home invaders. They couldn't find the mysterious blue hatchback that Pam and Roger said was parked in the driveway, and the two white male suspects were given such a generic description by Pam and Roger that really they could be hundreds of people. Also, Pam and Roger just consistently behaved like they were hiding something throughout the entire investigation, even before they had struggled with the lie detector tests. Knutson and his boss decided it was time to turn up the heat on the couple to see if they would crack. The sheriff's deputies still had no direct evidence that the couple actually harmed Kay or hired others to do it for them, but Knutson just felt like it was a matter of time before they confessed. On February 2nd, 2010, more than 10 weeks after Kay's murder, the sheriff's office announced to the media that Pam and Roger were persons of interest in Kay's murder. Investigators filed a court document laying out the inconsistencies in the couple's statements about the day of the murder and pointing out that Roger had a criminal history that included both violent threats and theft. Roger had been found guilty, but mentally ill, by a jury for stealing tools from the hardware store where he worked. A judge sentenced him to 45 days of home confinement, saying his depression was not an excuse for criminal behavior. The sheriff's office also complained that Pam and Roger had stopped cooperating with the investigation. Basically, investigators had stopped just short of actually saying that Pam and Roger were the murderers. Pam and Roger were now totally isolated. The entire Mortensen clan believed they were the murderers, except for one of Roger's aunts. However, she didn't think they were innocent. She just thought they hired a hitman to carry out the crime. Over the coming months, detectives would pore over every detail of Pam and Roger's life, while county prosecutors convened a secret grand jury to determine whether the evidence was enough to put the couple on trial. Sheriff's deputies also searched their home and cars, finding illegal weapons as well as marijuana. Finally, on July 29, 2010, 8 months after Kay's murder, the grand jury indicted Pam and Roger for murder. Prosecutors said the couple had misled investigators from the very first 911 call, and they never stopped misleading the investigation. Authorities were certain they were the ones who brutally killed Kay and then tried to make it look like a robbery gone bad. On the same day of the indictment, a team of armed sheriff's deputies showed up at Pam and Roger's door, accompanied by TV cameras. When Pam and Roger came to the door, the deputy told them they were under arrest for the murder of Kay Mortensen. They were booked into the Utah County Jail and ordered to be held until they could raise $500,000 bail. That night, 150 miles to the east in the town of Vernal, Utah, a young woman named Rachel Bingham watched the TV news showing Roger and Pam being let out of their home in handcuffs. The reporter said that the two would soon face trial for killing Roger's own father so that he could collect his inheritance earlier. Rachel shuddered as she watched the TV. She had been keeping a secret for months, and it was absolutely destroying her. She knew she needed to come clean to investigators. A couple of days later, on July 31st, Rachel finally got up the courage to call the Utah County Sheriff's Office. She was on the verge of tears as she began talking to the sheriff's deputy on the other end of the line. She told them that she had been withholding vital information about the Mortensen murder since March and had been trying to block the whole tragedy from her mind as the case against Pam and Roger progressed. But when she saw on TV that the couple was about to be tried for murder, Rachel said she just could not remain silent any longer. Rachel explained that she had just divorced her husband, who happened to know a lot about the Mortensen murder. Rachel didn't talk to her ex anymore, But right before their divorce, when they were still trying to work things out last March, he had told her that he really needed her help. Then he let her in on a huge secret. He said he knew who killed Kay Mortensen, and he even had the evidence to prove it. He had the guns that had been stolen from Kay's bomb shelter. But Rachel said her ex-husband feared that the killer was going to find the guns unless he found a new place to hide them, and so this was why he needed Rachel's help. And so, against her better judgment, Rachel had rented a U-Haul truck, and then she and her ex-husband had filled it with those 20 guns that had been stolen from Kay. Then, early on March 31st, the two drove into the desert near Vernal with their young son sitting in between them. Eventually, Rachel's ex directed Rachel into a wilderness park full of cliffs up to 100 feet high. Then the three of them walked down a trail into the woods until Rachel's ex-husband picked a secluded spot and began digging a hole to bury the guns in. After her ex-husband had tamped down the freshly overturned soil with a shovel and covered it with branches, he made Rachel promise not to tell anyone about the weapon stash. Otherwise, her ex-husband said, his life could be in danger. And so Rachel had kept her word until now. The deputy asked Rachel to please come into the sheriff's office for a formal interview. Rachel wiped away her tears and said she would. She had no choice. And so, the next day, Rachel drove to the sheriff's office in Provo, Utah to meet with Detective Knutson and his team, and as soon as she was settled down on a couch in front of the video camera, she began talking. Based on what Rachel told detectives, and also the detectives' follow-up investigation, here's what really happened on November 16th, 2009, the day Kay Mortensen was murdered. At about 5 p.m., the two killers pulled into Kay Mortensen's driveway inside of a blue hatchback vehicle. Their plan was to steal Kay's prized gun collection, but just in case, they were each carrying handguns if Kay gave them any trouble. But their motive was definitely robbery. The ringleader of this duo had serious money problems, and his sidekick could use some cash too. When the killers rang the doorbell, Kay instantly recognized the leader as someone who had been inside of his house many times, and so naturally he invited the pair into the house without any hesitation. The ringleader felt a surge of excitement as soon as they stepped through the door. His plan was actually working. Almost immediately, the killers pulled out their guns and handed Kay zip ties. They told him to bind his own wrists. Kay had seemed both surprised and annoyed to be treated so rudely by a friend, but he did as they asked. He then pointed out that his wife would be home soon, so they didn't have much time for whatever it was they wanted to do. The men said nothing in return and just put on latex gloves to make sure they did not leave behind fingerprints. Once their gloves were on, they told Kay that they wanted to know where to find his gun collection. The ringleader said he knew that Kay had scores of weapons, including very valuable antiques, so where were they? Kay directed the men to the guns in his bomb shelter without telling them about a much larger and much more valuable collection he kept inside of a safe. Even with guns pointed at him, Kay did not want to give up his best weapons. But the killers didn't question Kay, and instead, they took all the guns from the shelter and loaded them into the blue hatchback. But then, the home invasion took a dark turn. After loading all of the guns into the hatchback, the two killers went back inside the house, they grabbed Kay, and began walking him towards the stairs that led to the upstairs bathroom. As they passed through the kitchen, the sidekick happened to grab a butcher's knife. Now, the ringleader had not planned to kill Kay. But for some reason, after the sidekick had grabbed the knife and clearly showed he was going to use it on Kay, the ringleader just kind of went along with it. And so the two killers just walked Kay up the stairs into the bathroom, and they forced him over the side of the bathtub so his torso was kind of hanging in the tub and his legs were out. And then one of the two killers took the knife and began sawing at the front of Kay's neck. And as they did this, Kay began screaming in pain, and then after sawing away at his neck for a while, one of the killers took the knife, raised it high into the air, and then plunged it straight down into the back of Kay's neck. A blow he had seen used before in gladiator movies. Kay's body had barely gone limp when the killers heard the front doorbell ring. The sidekick got down to the door first, and he let Pam and Roger into the house as the leader was coming down the stairs as well. The sidekick then calmly told the couple that they were going to kill them. Roger immediately started crying, but Pam, she stayed cool. The killers zip-tied Pam and Roger's wrists and ankles and then left them kneeling in the living room for 45 minutes while the killers cleaned up the crime scene. But when they returned, Roger was praying aloud and the gunman stopped and quietly listened. The ringleader told his accomplice that there could be no more killing today, and the two men agreed to let the couple live as long as they blamed the crime on 3 African-American men. It would turn out Pam and Roger had actually been telling the truth the whole time. Then the 2 killers drove away from the scene with their stash of guns. They went out into the desert and buried them, figuring they would sell them when publicity about the murder died down. But as the investigation went on for months and months, the ringleader started to worry that his accomplice might turn the weapons into authorities and try to pin the murder on him. That's why he had asked Rachel to rent the U-Haul in March. The ringleader of the crime was Rachel's ex-husband, Martin Bond, whose father happened to be a dear friend of Kay Mortensen. 22-year-old Martin had been to Kay's house from time to time since he was a little boy, and he had bonded with Kay as an adult when they both took an emergency preparedness course together. Bond insisted to his ex-wife that he had only planned to rob Kay, not kill him, and that he had been powerless to stop his 22-year-old accomplice, Benjamin Rettig, from slaughtering Kay. In the end, the partners in crime turned on each other. Rettig claimed the whole crime was Bond's idea. Rettig said Bond had first told him about the robbery plan the day they actually carried it out, and he also insisted that Bond was the one who actually killed Kay. Rettig pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 25 years to life. As for Bond, he claimed he was innocent, but a jury convicted him and sentenced him to life without parole. He later admitted in jail that he had been the one who slashed Kay's throat, but he said he only did it because his partner, Rettig, had a gun aimed at him. As for Pam and Roger, they were released from jail on December 7, 2010, after 4 months of incarceration, and the prosecutor's office said the couple was fully exonerated. The couple sued the Utah County Sheriff's Department and prosecutors for falsely accusing them of murder. However, the lawsuit was tossed out because the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that no one can sue over inaccurate testimony made to a grand jury.
Shop lights still fade the same way. Then I see your shadow under neon rain. Like all these months just disappeared again. You smile first, but your eyes look tired. Like we both survived our own small fires. Funny how a stranger knows me best. Even after everything we left, we don't ask where the other's been. We don't touch, we just pretend. But silence says what words can't do. The past still lies between me and you. We once loved so deeply, now just a broken in-betweens in our eyes already said goodbye. You stand there like a memory, have you still stuck with me 1 second and the whole world moves back to me and you. Cars pass by, but
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out the rest of our studio